Hi everyone who is watching this video. My name is Alessandra Saviotti and I'm currently speaking from Amsterdam, the Netherlands, where I live, and I work as a curator, educator, and I'm also a PhD fellow at the Liverpool John Moores University. As long-term collaborator of the Associación de Arte Útil, I'm very happy today because I'll get to ask some questions to Marisa Moran Jahn, who is an artist and filmmaker and a creative technologist and the founder of Studio Rev, which is a non-profit organization that co-designs public art and creative media co-designed with low-wage workers, immigrants, and women. So today we are mainly talking about the domestic worker app, which is formerly known as a New Day, New Standard, which is included in our Arte Útil archive. And also more broadly, I think we are going to touch let's say, the journey of this project until today and what it became. Marisa's work has been featured at venues ranging from worker centers to the White House, to museums and festivals such as the Museum of Modern Art, the Walker Art Center, Tribeca Film Festival, the Asian Art Museum, New Museum, and Art Brussels. And her work has been widely covered by the New York Times, Art Forum, Art in America, the BBC, the CNN, Univision, Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal, Hyperallergic, and many, many more. Marisa is also an awardee of Creative Capital, Sundance, and Anonymous Was a Woman. And she regularly teaches at the Columbia University, MIT, the New School, where she's an assistant professor and lectures internationally. So thank you, Maria, for being here with us today. I'm super happy to have you, and thank you for agreeing to record this interview.
Thank you, Alessandra.
So I just want to start, I guess, asking you how you came up with the idea of the domestic worker app. And I'm curious in particular about the context and the urgency that pushed you towards creating the app first, and then consequently the other developments of the project.
So the project really begins in 2010 when an organizer, also my collaborator, Ai-Jen Pu, was organizing domestic workers, which is nannies, housekeepers, and caregivers, to share their stories with lawmakers in Albany. And what they were trying to do was reverse decades of race-based exclusion. So going back in history, and the reason why we, in the United States, you know, people are always saying domestic workers are invisible, but why are they invisible? And there's specific historic moments that we can look at. So one is in the 1930s and 40s, when most of the workers are receiving their basic rights. Southern lawmakers did not want to give these same rights to domestic workers because they feared that if this group of people, who were largely African-American, Black at the time, domestic workers as well as street vendors and farm workers, if they received these same rights, that economic power would translate into political power, and that was a threat to dominant white order. So this is the moment when domestic workers did not get their basic rights. And again, that was in various moments in the United States, we see that exclusion, race-based exclusion, persisting. So in 2010, when domestic workers passed the nation's first domestic workers Bill of Rights, this gave them the same basic rights: overtime wage, days of rest, a meal break, and so forth. So what's important here is that domestic workers are sharing their stories, which is this beautiful thing because it's seemingly the most immaterial of, it's nothing, and yet you can create something with it, which is metaphysical and beautiful. An advocacy organization reached out to Studio Rev, to me, and asked to help get the word out to the state's 200,000 domestic workers. And this was at a time when smartphones were not financially accessible. print literacy was not an option because the domestic workers in New York are very international and come from all over the world. And people were not listening to the radio like they used to be. So we needed to create a new platform and a new way to reach and inform domestic workers about their new rights. So there is only a handful of precedents of civic media platforms that are really specifically geared for a community like domestic workers who are informally organized and who are low-wage workers. One was so taxi cabs, the West African taxi cab drivers. One person on our team was formerly a taxi cab driver, and he would describe that they called in and with a flip phone, and they would listen to someone reading in Wolof the news from back home. And it was culturally, very specific information, and it felt them feel empowered and connected. Another precedent was a project called Boss Mob, which the designer and media theorist Sasha Constanza Schock created with day laborers, Latinx day laborers in Los Angeles. And you could use your flip phone to take photos of the work that you did to make sure that there's evidence and documentation so that you would not be, your employer could not take away your wages or deny you wages. And you could send messages to the rest of the community and tell them about jobs and so forth. So they're really specific informations of civic media that informed what we did. So we adapted the Voss Mob platform and created the domestic worker app. And the way that it works is that you can call using any kind of phone at any hour to hear these short audio novellas. And the content of the audio novellas are, meal breaks, overtime wage. Eventually they began to include things, and the other media we created alongside with it included things about labor trafficking, sexual harassment. So they're topics that are really hard. They're sometimes very dense legal information, and also at the same time, sometimes emotionally hard. So the way that we made it palatable was that we made it very quirky. It's very playful. So in one episode, there's a dancing ham sandwich who is advising. He thinks this ham sandwich is happy because he does not know that there's a new law giving the domestic worker a meal break, and he thinks he will not get eaten. Sometimes there were, in one episode about respiratory health, there were these two lungs, and they have these thick Bronx accents, and one is like, "Hey lady, knock it down over there, you're killing us," and the other one is like the sidekick, and they're like telling their owner not to mix chemicals, cleaning detergents, because they can cause these deadly gases. So what we found was that the more surreal that these audio novellas got, the more effective they were. And so that was the basis of the audio novella app that we created.
Yeah.
And then the project really grew from there, because then we wanted to, this was most effective when domestic workers were reaching out to their peers. And when it's like a one-to-one transmission, when we were telling someone, showing someone how they worked. So we needed to figure out how to meet domestic workers where they're at. And at the same time, the movement for domestic workers' rights was growing across the country. So after a year or two, Massachusetts and California started organizing, and then in Connecticut and Chicago and so forth. So to meet domestic workers where they're at, we created the nanny van, which is this bright orange mobile vehicle, and allowed me and my son, who was still a baby then, and our nanny, who was also an actress and some of the voices in the audio novellas, and two media makers to come with us. And we traveled, I don't know, over 20,000 miles in the nanny van, and then later our second car, the Care Force One, to co-create these different works. Do you want me to keep on going, or what questions do you have?
Yeah, well, I was wondering, perhaps an interesting question is or at least for me, I'm curious about that. So how, I mean, you, if I understand correctly, you said that you were approached by the organization of domestic workers, right? So I guess that your role was already quite clear in the process. So you were commissioned as an artist, as a creative person, in order to think about a possible way of spreading information amongst domestic workers. So I was wondering, during the first phase of the project, so making people aware that this app exists, but also later through the car and then the van, how did you approach domestic workers and care workers around the country? And also, I think I'm talking about how would you approach them? Like, would you tell them, "Hi, I'm an artist," or like, "Hi, I'm you know, like I'm another kind of campaign manager, etc., etc." So I'm pretty much curious to understand how you were positioning yourself while distributing the new, like the materials.
Yeah, I mean, my training is as an artist in undergrad and then graduate school, and really it's my first love and my first home. There, for 10 years, I was working with advocates and journalists, and specifically because I wanted to get insight from about how you create social impact. So, I mean, I was working, before I was doing this project, for example, I was working as a community organizer, organizing street vendors, and that was what my day job was. It's the same kind of community, immigrant, informal, often undocumented immigrants. Because what I saw was that, you know, in the arts, it's not very often that you have a victory, you know, but I was just astounded working with these social justice advocates about, you know, how you navigate the media, what it means to organize and mobilize people, and how you set goals to then achieve those goals. And I worked with so many talented people. So I learned, and always learning from advocates. And really this project is for, you know, this project with the domestic worker app and the nanny van, the care force that comes after it, is I spend hundreds of hours looking, like reading policy documents and legal information. And then I work with lawyers and advocates, and we figure out the opportunities and what we have to work with, you know, and strategy. But I find sometimes, like in my translation of that, in my involvement, I sometimes will find things that they won't find. So it's mutually beneficial. So that's I think the first part of your question. The second part of my question is, how do I, when I'm approaching someone, let's say on the street, I mean, oftentimes, like if I'm literally on the street doing outreach, the thing that is most important are the things that translate into a financial difference for domestic workers. So I say, "Oh, do you know you're entitled?" Like if they're walking with a child, I say, "Oh, are you a nanny? Do you know that do you know that you're now entitled to time and a half overtime wage?" So this is like translates to a gain for them. And I mean, the difference of overtime wage is the difference in terms of not eating and being able to feed your own family. So they immediately understand. The other thing that we were surprised to learn was when we were handing out information or inviting people to come and chat or share stories, whatever, another hook was, we would say, "Oh, are you interested in green cleaning tips that is healthier for your employer's home and your own family too? Low cost, safe and effective green cleaning products." So there's the financial information there, and then there's the health information, because I think, you know, when you're cleaning, when you're on your knees and you're cleaning and you're breathing in these chemicals, you're really consciously aware of the fact that you're injuring your body. And it's also, you're aware of the chemicals that your employer. So it translates to a financial gain, because you can say to your employer, "Oh, I use green cleaning tips." or I use green cleaning products, which is healthier for your home, so that it gives them a value added. And also they are understanding, these domestic workers, if they make the green cleaning products themselves, that it's cheaper and it's better for their own family. So, so that's the hook. That's the first kind of hook. If I'm asked to identify myself, I mean, usually I identify, I have been a caretaker of someone who is in a wheelchair, and I have been someone who's also a domestic employer. So my son is needs care. We still have a babysitter to pick him up from school sometimes, and my grandmother needed care. So I understand very intimately the cost of care and the challenges of finding good caregivers. So I think it makes it relatable.
Mm.
You know, if I'm talking with a nanny, or if I'm talking with a mom or a dad or a parent who's, you know,
Yeah.
everyone's having a care crisis in America.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. No, thank you. That was very clear. And also, I think it's really, like something that I have been seeing a lot when there is like a sort of personal urgency to create something from ourselves. And then because we know the condition, because we have been through that, and sometimes in the context of art or this kind of archive that I am co-curating, it's very clear how art represents a very effective strategy and a very effective ground to foster another kind of, let's say, not really solution, but an alternative to the condition that some people or us are living. So I was wondering then, since you have been involved with the movements for a very long time, if there is any, let's say, specific political effect or transformation that through the project you were able to reach?
So the question is about social impact then, perhaps,
Yeah.
or how we measure that, or what we've seen.
Yeah.
I mean, since we started the project, and we've been working with advocates who are doing, work day in, day out on the ground all the time. I mean, there have been, now I think there's 7 states that have, in one city, that have domestic workers' Bill of Rights. The Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have both been supporters of domestic workers for many years prior, vocally, in public. So that offers a promise. Kamala Harris was one of the people sponsoring a bill to introduce federal legislation for domestic workers. So that's also very promising what could come. So, I mean, and we know that the function of the audio development and the Care Force project as a whole, within this ecology of organizing and base building and activism, we operate at the beginning part. So we understand that what we're doing is we're naming and we're making familiar introducing these new terms to the people who aren't already familiar with these terms. We understand, and this is like something that's communicated between me and the National Domestic Workers Alliance about where I best can play in this ecology. So it's about appealing to the unconverted, someone who may not see themselves as a domestic worker or may not know that they're already a domestic employer. So certainly we've seen an increasing consciousness about that. I mean, we have counted the number of people who we have reached, like physically on the ground, either handing out things or involved in some way, which is about 25,000 people. We know that, there's maybe 10,000 people who have called into the domestic worker app over the years, unique callers. We know that the media picked up and was reporting about these projects, and through the coverage, it's millions more. And I know that a friend of mine who lives in rural Honduras She saw it on Univision, where they don't have that many televisions, but she saw it on Univision Global all the way in Honduras. So it went, all the way to it went around Latin America too. So, and we hear over and over again that, things like, a woman said to us, have been taking care of kids. I've been a nanny for 15 years, but I have not proudly identified as a nanny until I saw the nanny van. We heard from a woman when we launched the film, the Care Force One Travelogues film. This woman came to the launch of the film, and I didn't ask her. She volunteered the information that she had joined the local worker center because she was out on the street, and she's a domestic worker, and she it's what got her excited about joining the movement, or wanting to learn more, or seeing her own lived experience as a form of power. So, there's on the other side, there was a curator who's a wonderful and progressive individual. His daughter it needs a caregiver. She's a physical disability, and his parents need care. He had a nanny growing up. He said, my whole life I've grown up with domestic workers, and I never thought about these women's lives until I saw the nanny van and read about it in your newsletter. So, I think it's the kind of thing where it just, when it's working, it's sticking, and it's introducing something, and then it just, like the art component of it gives you like another, it's like more difficult to dislodge, and you start thinking about it more. I have many examples, but those are the ones that stand out.
Yeah. But thank you for that. And while I was thinking about this conversation, let's say this interview, and while I was going through the many, chapters of your project, this year, let's say that we are still in the middle of a global pandemic, I was really thinking about how this project, since the very beginning, has been really highlighting let's say the vulnerability of this kind of workers, but at the same time their very important role in a way, especially now. So I was also thinking that like the reaction that I had at the beginning was like, like this kind of artist, and Marisa already knew in advance that the role of caregivers is so important, and is going to be more and more important, and let's say clear to everybody. So I was thinking about the last, let's say, chapter of the project, which is the care house, which is super interesting. And I think, again, it's kind of not just reacting to something, but really anticipating, let's say, a condition that we probably would live in the future. So I was wondering if you can say a little bit about this particular project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what you touched upon is important, because it's not by accident that under the pandemic we see an increased attention to domestic workers, because I think those of us who are working in this field know that there, we anticipate that there's going to be increasing care crises, and for specific demographic reasons. So baby boomers, so those, the massive wave of people who were born after World War II, when troops came home and people started making babies, those people are all retiring. Baby boomers are now retiring, and it's this unprecedented, in the United States and other industrialized countries, phenomenon that our policies do not anticipate. There's not enough supports for these people who will increasingly need care. So, and the problem only gets worse by the year 2050, when 1/5 of those people 1/5 of all the people in the United States will need some kind of care just to get out of bed or have a meal and so forth. So it's not by accident. And then with, the climate crisis, there'll be, increasing amounts of moments when we have these disasters. And so this is an opportunity in a moment right now to build up what our collaborators at the National Domestic Workers Alliance called a care grid, and this kind of infrastructure, and it leads to the care house because, if we think about the spaces of, well, first of all, it's like we don't have in our consciousness this idea of valuing care properly, right? We have monuments to war, we have monuments to victory, but what would it look like to create a monument that honors care? We have, there's different professions that have infrastructures and structures, right? And physical spaces and rooms, right? Like, so actors, there's a green room, there's a whole infrastructure for actors, right? Artists have a studio. There's firemen have a fire station, but domestic workers are always, it's this architecture of the undercommons. It's the inferior spaces within the larger, the master, the employer's home, right? It's things like domestic workers in Hong Kong take over the public spaces because they're live-in, they have no space of their own. On their one day off, they're crowding, they're creating this space of mutualism, right? Sometimes the spaces of domestic workers are intentionally invisible. So during times when there's anti-immigration backlash, domestic workers, sometimes they're obscuring their worker centers. So there's not spaces for immigration raids, the immigration officials aren't coming in, or even like worse, sometimes domestic workers are finding refuge in a church, finding sanctuary to avoid being deported. So it's a space of invisibility, of it's makeshift, it's provisional, it's sometimes intentionally out of view and obscured. So this is, this question of, well, what would it look like to create an architecture? So this is like, exemplifies this idea that we have not valued caregivers and we have not seen them as having power, but what would it look like to build an architecture and build an infrastructure that values care, which is central to family life and working parents. So the idea of care house comes from, on the one hand, it's my own personal experience where I wanted and could not afford care. I went into debt. And I wanted to be sharing care, but I realized, most of our homes in the United States are built for the nuclear family, right? They're not built with mutual spaces where we can watch each other kids and so forth. Then also encountering a text in Ai-jen Poo's book called The Age of Dignity. In the appendix, she penned this line about what she was calling a care pod. And at that time, so the idea was that caregivers would live with and care for older people or disabled people. And over time, they themselves would own their own homes or have equity. So, a year ago, I approached an architect, Rafi Seagal, who has been designing co-living spaces for the past 15 years in Rwanda, the Philippines, Israel, and the United States. And we started thinking about what this would look like and working out the details. And after speaking with a few real estate developers, which is can tend to be a conservative sector, we met an incredible individual named Ernst Valerie, who's a Haitian American immigrant who is an urban planner and real estate developer. And he said, yeah, I think this is great. His mother had multiple jobs and had also worked as a caregiver and a house cleaner. And it was really well matched with him. And so he said, I just bought these 4 row houses, abandoned row houses in Baltimore. Let's do it there. Let's pilot it there. And it was almost like too good to be true. But, he is an amazing human. And we found a CFO who's at the intersection of healthcare and finance, Ellen Iskovitz. And so throughout this year, we've been co-designing and iteratively prototyping and designing what this looks like. And so we start building in the spring, and then we'll open in 2022, which will be the first site.
Cool. Very nice. I'm really looking forward to that, and hopefully we could travel again, and I would be happy to visit it when it's ready.
Yeah.
Just to conclude, because when you were talking about especially this last project, you were mentioning that basically the architect was already working in different projects in different places, not only in the United States. So it made me think about a last, let's say, question or curiosity that I have. Have you been ever involved with other international movement that are advocating for domestic worker?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, there is an international group that's based in Geneva, okay, that coordinates domestic worker stuff all over the world, or it's part of a broader network. I mean, I receive inquiries and calls, or emails from people in different countries, from Lebanon to, so many different places. And I mean, it's fascinating, of course, because the factors that shape the challenges that domestic workers in those countries face, I mean, in any country face, are so specific and so variegated that it really becomes a lens for geopolitics and feminism.
Yeah.
And labor rights. So, so yeah, I mean, I think there's examples with the idea with the care houses is multi-generational care, as in, I want my son to grow up in a space that's not socially isolating, where there's older people that he can learn from. And that's what I want for myself as an older, when I get old and wrinkly, it's like I want to live in a care house.
Yeah, indeed. All right. Okay, so I think that's all for now. Thank you very much, Marisa. It was really fascinating to learning more about the app, but also all the projects in, let's say, in the series. And good luck with the next step of the project, and looking forward to.
Thank you.
Thank you
for this opportunity, Alessandra, and your support.